Welcome to Vanadium. The more I learn about this mad world, the more mysterious it seems to me. Today's episode is about a man who's not a household name, but he probably should be, because his influence is affecting us, I think, even more so recently. And the man basically presided over the 20th century, lived to be 104 years old, a ghoul, nephew of Sigmund Freud. And he was basically the inventor of propaganda. Just to give you an idea of how basically respected he was in the intellectual world, Joseph Goebbels, the head Nazi, basically one of the top 5 members of the Nazi leadership, basically the architect of the propaganda campaign that took over Germany and destroyed a whole world. Basically affected the whole world to this day. These ideas started, Joseph Goebbels twisted them in a new direction, but they were actually started by a man called Edward Bernays. And this man, a Jewish man, actually Joseph Goebbels respected, it's amazing that he could respect Edward Bernays, and actually he ripped off Edward Bernays' work. Really, Edward Bernays was the one who invented this, the whole idea of twisting public psychology. And Bernays was definitely Jewish. I believe his grandfather was actually a well-known rabbi. But Joseph Goebbels, incidentally, was probably one of the most, if not the most, anti-Semitic figures that I have ever come across in any of my research. And there have been times, well, I thought about characterizing him with some quotes. But honestly, I don't want Joseph Goebbels' words coming out of my mouth and the horrible things he says about Jewish people. And just to give you an idea of Joseph Goebbels and his just insane, belligerent hatred for Jewish people for reasons I just don't understand. He, on the photo on the left, you'll see his face. He's just smiling. He's getting ready to be photographed by a photographer. And then on the right, this is moments after, when he realizes the photographer's last name is Eisenstadt, Alfred Eisenstadt. And let me just zoom in here. They call this, it's a very famous photograph, and it's often referred to as the Eyes of Hate. And I think it's a really appropriate title. And so Joseph Goebbels was a horrible man, but he was in love with the ideas of Edward Bernays. Strange, and it's interesting because one of the horrible quote that stood out to me is he says, the Jewish people are uncreative. Well, one of them was creative enough for you to steal from and basically make a whole career and a whole tyranny out of. So, interesting, Joseph Goebbels. Well, Joseph Goebbels aside, Bernays is, no angel. And really, it's an interesting case how somebody can really be behind the scenes and having so much influence in the world, and people don't even really know about him. And I only learned about him a few years ago with this documentary called The Century of the Self. It's an old BBC documentary.
It was the start of the all-consuming self, which has come to dominate our world today.
About Edward Bernays' influence over the 20th century. And he's Sigmund Freud's nephew. A way more fascinating, and I think maybe even on par level of evil as his Nazi counterpart in Germany. And it's really amazing that Joseph Goebbels, who could say the most horrible, wretched things about Jewish people, even is quoted as saying positive things that he respected. And, well, it's the least he could do. He ripped the man's work off. And Edward Bernays, it's funny, the man, he always said he didn't want to have any part of the Nazi campaign. He didn't understand what they were doing with his work. But I believe if you look at what he's doing, he had to know that he was unleashing a terrible weapon. And even he himself implemented it in some really horrible ways that I'm going to go into in this episode. He's the nephew of Sigmund Freud. And I'm not a big fan of Sigmund Freud. I think he's kind of an overblown shithead. And I always thought when I was young, I remember him from Bill and Ted. That's really was my first. And I thought, oh, wow, he seems like a smart guy, like a good therapist, into cigars. But, you know, when I got to college, I read some of his work as part of a class. I say read, more tried to read. It was fucking incomprehensible. I don't understand how he ever really caught on. I think he's had some very obvious things to say about psychology because I guess he thought about it a lot that ended up, you know, I do think play out to be true. But I think his deep philosophies are really just off and distorted. And I think he has a very negative view of humanity. And I think it stems from a lot of self-hatred. And I think he was, you know, I hate to blame anything on drug addiction or anything, but he was one of the worst cocaine addicts in history, and I think his jaw did sort of rot off at the end. Anyway, Edward Bernays really took a lot of Freud's ideas and made them, and he kind of weaponized Sigmund Freud. And really he used his conclusions about human nature, sexuality, religion, and basically herd politics. And Edward Bernays basically was in line with what I consider really just kind of almost psychopathic, dark reductions and simplifications of the way you characterize human nature. And I think that the fact that it hangs on today is just sort of for lack of a better term, a bummer to all of culture. And I think it's really interesting that he and Carl Jung kind of hung together for a while. They were in the same gang. And then they parted ways over very serious differences. And they all sort of hung in this circle in Vienna. And there were a few other people there. Adolf Hitler, Joseph Goebbels was there for a time, and Friedrich Nietzsche, and Carl Jung. Remember from the last episode. And his uncle Sigmund Freud was part of this scene as well. And the whole... the title that Edward Bernays liked to use was public relations. He invented the term public relations. And it was really to replace the term propaganda. He didn't like that. He didn't like the political context. He didn't like being associated with the Nazi campaign, even though his ideas were clearly in line with their philosophy. So, and he is, and just looking at his history, he's kind of easy to hate. He's easy to demonize. But I have bits of interviews that I'll show. And I think he sort of speaks for himself. He really has an awful view of human nature, a really reductive and cynical view. And it's very interesting. So he didn't start out as a propaganda master. Before his real foray into evil, it was actually, you know, he moved to the U.S. in the early 1900s, and he got married and he went to school, and after he graduated, he didn't get a job as propaganda minister or head Dr. Evil. He had to get a job in grain exporting, and what's interesting is he followed that job up with being co-editor of basically a medical journal. And he took editorial positions in favors of showers and against corsets. And all sorts of other weird things that sort of caught on with early sort of consumer culture. And that's how he made a living, sort of creating commercials and advertising based on very loose science. Really kind of twisted science. Really lies. So for instance, ivory soap. He was behind the early invention of ivory soap, and his whole thing was, oh, watch it float. Oh, watch it float. Well, two reasons. It's really sort of not even really proper soap. And also, it's filled with air bubbles, which is why it floats. It's just less soap. So you're actually ripping people off. But anyway, he touted that as a remarkable feature for ivory soap. And I'm not sure if it still floats anymore. I remember there was some commercial about that years ago, but I'll have to do more research on that if I ever get interested. But ivory soap, I know it's a fraud. He also, one of his, really, some people credit, and I think rightly so, Edward Bernays as the inventor of smoking.
Today, Mr. George Hill, president of the American Tobacco Company, one of the largest, maybe the largest tobacco company extant at that time, called me in and said, we're losing half of our market. And I said, why, Mr. Hill? He said, there's a taboo of men, there's a taboo by men that does not permit women to smoke, either in public or even at home. What can we do about breaking down that taboo? I said, have I your permission to see a psychoanalyst? He said, what'll it cost? I said, let me ask. So I called up Dr. Brill, who was one of the great disciples of my uncle Sigmund Freud. Said, what'll it cost, Dr. Brill, for me to have a little conference with you on a question that is of importance to the people whom I'm working with?
So it had caught on with men. I mean, don't get me wrong, the cigarette companies were doing pretty good jobs themselves. But he really lined up the advertising. And I think the show Mad Men kind of captured some of this, sort of stole some of the, but I don't think Edward Bernays was as glamorous in person. I'll show you in some of the, you'll see in the interviews. So one of his other, the big thing that really kind of got him rich and famous is developing a campaign to get women to smoke. And he used his sort of Sigmund Freud's sexuality, penis envy, kind of twisted idea of women's thinking, and he wanted to call cigarettes torches of freedom, and touted it as it would add to feminine mystique, and that even though like polling had shown that men didn't really like women who smoked, Edward Bernays was determined. He's like, no, they're gonna like them anyway. And so women liked it so much that they started smoking more than men. And it became this, basically an accessory to, sort of, you want to show your strength and your femininity. And, people hadn't been twisted up with commercials like this before Edward Bernays. It really was sort of like the invention of lying, where commercials, very early advertising, it was just sort of utilitarian in its view, and it touted sort of long-term durability of things. And then Edward Bernays invented the idea of disposable items and disposable consumerism. So the whole idea of the fashion industry, that's Edward Bernays. And it's amazing that one man could do all of this. But he invented smoking, really, because it caught on like any other vice that men had. But it became a phenomenon with the advertising. And it really it showed advertising companies the power of psychological warfare. And he wrote a bunch of books, and his quotes speak for themselves. And Crystallizing Public Opinion offers a bunch of really, really good quotes. The only difference between propaganda and education, really, is the point of view. The advocacy of what we believe is education. The advocacy of what we don't believe is propaganda. Edward Bernays had he had a real vision of a utopian society of sort of perfect consumer culture. But people had to constrain their libidinal energies. He was very scared of sexuality in general. It was a beast that was about to be unleashed and destroy all of society. As if sexuality was going to destroy society. That was what's going to do it. That was Freud's whole idea. Sexuality and basically unconstrained urges were going to destroy sexuality, basically destroy the world. It's pretty absurd. Also, Sigmund Freud was not very kind to women in his views. Basically said that women had sort of a lower moral capacity. Here's a great quote from Crystallizing Public Opinion. Think about that title, Crystallizing Public Opinion. This is 1923. Domination today is not a product of armies or navies or wealth or policies. It is a domination based on one hand upon accomplished unity, and on the other hand upon the fact that the opposition is generally characterized by a high degree of disunity. Well, so you don't even have to really do much if you can have your enemy in shambles. I think that's kind of appropriate today. See what's happened to the whole liberal side of things. Oh, I don't want to get political here. Here's another quote. This is an age of mass production. In the mass production of materials, a broad technique has been developed and applied to their distribution. In this age, too, there must be a technique for the mass distribution of ideas. See, ideas as things to be sort of pushed and promoted, and to sort of, he's realizing the power of ideas to take hold and to control people, control buying behavior, to generate money, to run industries. So this I think says a lot. This is a short and sweet quote. Propaganda is the executive arm of the invisible government. Now, that's quite a statement. Here's another one. This is from 1928, from his book Propaganda. The conscious and intelligent manipulation of the organized habits and opinions of the masses is an important element in democratic society. Jeez. Those who manipulate this unseen mechanism of society constitute an invisible government, which is the true ruling power of our country. We are governed, our minds are molded, our taste formed, our ideas suggested, largely by men we have never heard of. Edward Bernays being one of them. This is a logical result of the way in which our democratic society is organized. Vast numbers of human beings must cooperate in this manner if they are to live together smoothly in a functioning society. So basically, the herd has to be managed by a shepherd. Edward Bernays, I guess, is going to be that shepherd. His whole idea was he wanted to create desire in people. So people, this whole consumer culture was something that was sort of engineered. He wanted to create like a hole, a vacuum in people. He wanted to create drives to go for people to fill a hole that he created. And he knew this, and it's written in his words. Like this was part of his engineering, and he wanted to exploit it. And he thought in his mind, or at least this is what he touted, as that he was helping society function by controlling them like sheep. But it didn't go very well, and his ideas, when the people who really ran with them were the Nazis. He wanted to create people as really economic machines. He says, if we understand the mechanisms and motives of the group mind, is it not possible to control and regiment the masses according to our will without their knowing it? Now, see, why would you need to hide it? The recent practice of propaganda has proved that it is possible, at least to a certain point and within certain limits. He later called this scientific technique of opinion molding the engineering of consent. This phrase, I guess, means a scientific approach to managing the herd, but at a great expense, a great psychological toll on people. I mean, I don't think therapists' offices were filled before all of this nonsense really took hold. And he kind of looks very ghoulish to me as well. And he loved Freud. He was really a devotee of Freud. And in a way, more successful. I mean, Freud really didn't do a very good job of promoting his own ideas. Freud really relied on his daughter a lot to promote his ideas. Anna Freud was a devotee. She was such a strong promoter of her father's work. She published his books, and she went around and gave talks. And basically, she gave a better Freud talk than Freud could. Because honestly, and his writing really wasn't that great. And she apparently, the ones that she edited, his writing was actually a hell of a lot better. So Anna Freud was really kind of a big promoter, and I don't think Freud would have really taken off without his daughter being on board and really being behind her dad. Too bad he was such a creep. I just don't like Freud. I love Carl Jung. I just don't like Freud. And the more I learn about him and the way his ideas are used, and it makes sense. And I think he'd be all right. I think Edward Bernays would love the COVID era because he greatly believed in using fear as a sort of a guiding force and almost a guiding philosophy, which is the worst part of it. Our deepest fears, using psychology to push people. And basically, we can see what now in the news, that not only in the news, but also in all TV shows, in movies, everybody, to me, I always thought growing up when I would see people in the movies and on TV, like, everybody's so wealthy, they're so rich. It's just like, it's very, and they all live, everything seems so perfect. Except when there's like a monster or something coming through. But it was, everybody's prim and proper. Everybody was the idea of like, you need a house, you have things to fill it. And even sort of taking the idea off of how you're going to fill it emotionally in terms of family. And I think that the whole idea of a strong family bond was a threat to what Edward Bernays' vision. And I think he said as much. He really wanted to have a core molding philosophy, sort of basically a dystopian. You wouldn't call it dystopian. I call it dystopian. Just march to a beat of a single drummer. And I guess the trains would run on time. So he goes on. This man invents smoking. He does all these terrible advertising campaigns. And he just ends up on David Letterman.
Over here, there you go. Doctor, tell me again what the doctor is. What are we dealing with here? You're the father of public relations.
What we're dealing with really is the concept that people will believe me more if you call me doctor.
Oh, I see.
And he had a lot of things to say about just rethinking democracy and how basically the people have way too much power. And imagine thinking that people have too much power. It's amazing. So also he really was a big proponent of polling as well. So he brought a lot of that, and all that sort of horrifying scientific sort of engineering wisdom to crafting public opinion and basically lying to the masses. But he's a man who you could really say the devil was here. And he wasn't a household name. But I think if you look at real evil intellectual leadership, Edward Bernays really can't be topped. And that's why I spread the word. I like to talk, and I just can't. The Century of Self is a great documentary that I definitely recommend checking out in addition to this, because I can't do this full topic justice. But I hope that I hope this interests people enough to go look more into Edward Bernays. And this has been Vanadium. Thank you very much. Stay safe out there.